All right, welcome to our special board meeting tonight. March 5th. It's election day and it's not too late. So if you haven't voted yet, you can still drop off your ballot. And let's start with the flag salute. Please stand. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, Erin, could we have roll call, please?
Yes. Trustee Leon.
Here.
Trustee Manhattan.
Here.
Trustee Chow.
Here.
Trustee Liu.
Here.
Trustee Vogel.
Present. Opening items, board agenda approval. We need a motion.
So moved.
Thank you, Jerry.
I'll second.
Thank you, Ava. Roll call vote.
Trustee Leon.
Aye.
Trustee Manhattan.
Aye.
Trustee Chow.
Aye.
Trustee Liu.
Aye.
Trustee Vogel.
Aye. Erin, do we have any employee organizations today?
No, we do not.
Okay, this is going to go pretty fast. Public comment. Do we have public comment?
No, we do not.
All righty. Discussion. Second interim. I assume that's Mr. Jew.
Before we start, I did just want to share and express with the board that the agreement to allow us to hold the special board meeting. No matter how carefully we plan out our board meetings and our calendars, it just never fits when we have our February and we're trying to make sure that we're have board meetings to meet that March 15th in case we have to do layoffs, and then we have to look at second interim. And so it just never seems to work to our time. And we always want to ensure that you have adequate time to review the budget. So tonight really is that discussion. We know that you've only had it for the last 24 hours to take a look at, but really want to engage in that dialogue so that when we bring it back in 10 days, you've had that time to really discuss, and we could bring it back and have some discussion next week before we actually approve it as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chris and Tina and their department, who I know have worked endless hours in getting this ready to go. We can update you some of the changes, the difference between a first interim and second interim. As you may have observed, there are some changes to that, so they'll walk us through that.
All right. Thank you, Stacey, and good evening, everybody. Let me first thank Tina. Tina is actually here, and I just want to thank her and staff for spending a lot of time and effort in putting together these in-room reports. I mean, without Tina and her staff, I mean, we wouldn't be able to do this for you guys. So tonight, I've asked Tina to help co-present with me, so she'll go through some of the second interim stuff in regards to the changes and things like that. And I'll spend maybe a little bit more of the time on the back end, kind of talking about this shifting. And since we've been talking about moving into a basic aid funded district, I think it's just as important to continue to talk about what it means, because there are some implications for it as we move forward. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tina. She can get going with the second presentation.
Perfect. Good evening. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you tonight about our second interim. So throughout my presentation tonight, we'll refer to relevant pages in your budget book. So if you want to have that handy throughout the presentation, we'll refer to specific pages so that way you've got a reference tool, and if you want to follow along. So the first thing we'll reference is the budget calendar. You'll find that on page 4 of your budget book. You'll always find that towards the beginning of the budget book. It's just a quick overview of the important dates throughout the year for when we'll be reviewing the budget with the Budget Advisory Committee, when we're bringing it to the board, and as we're following this calendar. So as you can see, we're at the second interim phase. We've completed the budget adoption. We've gone through that budget revision, the 45-day update back in August. We did the unaudited actuals from last year. We got the first interim done in December, and now we are at second interim. So second interim includes all actual expenses through January 31st. So it includes all actuals through January 31st, and then projections for February through June. Then once we get through second interim, we'll be bringing to you in June both the 24-25 preliminary budget adoption, as well as sorry, I got confused for a second.
Okay.
Is that the
that's the
budget adoption?
Budget adoption for 24-25.
And then the unaudited actuals. will be in September.
September.
Sorry. I got thrown off for a second. All right, so moving right along. So just a refresher on the budget and fiscal cycle. So as you remember, this is kind of the cycle that we go through each time. The part we just wanted to hit on here is that anytime we're doing a budget, we're not just doing the current year budget, we're planning an additional 4 years in advance. So we're actually planning out 5 years. That's what we call our multi-year projection. So each time we're doing this, we're actually not just planning the current year, 23, 24, but we're planning all the way through 27, 28. So before I get into revenue changes, just a couple of tidbits. So as you guys know, enrollment and attendance affect our revenues. So in your budget book on pages 10, 11, and 12, you'll have updates on our enrollment and on our attendance. So in case you wanted to take a look to see how attendance is adjusting and what we're projecting on attendance, as well as how overall district enrollment, we use the demographers report that you guys saw back in December. We use that to help us to do those projections. So those are all updated with those new demographer report projections. So I wanted to point out that. I also wanted to point out page 15 in your book. Page 15 in your book is an overview of where we started with the adopted budget, then what we said at first interim, and then what we said at second interim. So you can see really high level what the changes were between the adopted budget, what we said at first interim, and then where we're at with second interim. And we're going to dive into those a little bit deeper, but that just gives you the high level changes. So one of the things we wanted to touch base on is, okay, so what is different between first interim and second interim? So when we're putting together the first interim, it's earlier in the year. The expenses are only through October. You've only gotten through a couple months of the fiscal year. School's only been in session for a couple months. So it's really early in the year to try and figure out what resources you're going to be utilizing, what programs you're going to be running, what expenses you're actually going to have. And so what we did at first interim was we looked at each individual program and said, okay, if this program were to use all of its revenue, spend all of its expenses, where would we be at the end of the year? So first interim is kind of what I call a fully loaded budget. If we planned and did everything that we possibly could this fiscal year, where would we end? So that's kind of your first interim. Then when we get to second interim, now we're at expenses through January. We're halfway through the year. My team has had an opportunity to sit down and meet with all of the departments, the schools, and have conversations about, are you really going to do this? Are you sure you're going to do this? Maybe you're going to move it and do that next year instead. So we have lots of conversations to try and figure out, okay, what do we think is really going to happen now between now and the end of the year? So you see fine tuning in second interim to get us to a more accurate pinpoint projection as to where we're going to end the year. So when you see some of these changes that I'm going to describe, you'll kind of understand like, oh, that's why it was so much higher, or that's why it's come down. You'll kind of see how that unfolds. So let's talk a little bit about revenue. So overall, our revenue changes. Our revenue increased from first interim to second interim by about $585,000. Overall, where did that come from? So our LCAP supplemental was adjusted because our unduplicated pupil count actually went up. And so when that unduplicated pupil count goes up, that increases our supplemental money, which increases the revenue, which then increases the expenses. So that was one of our adjustments. Our contribution to special ed actually came down a little bit. We were able to do some adjustments and tweaks with some of the expenditures in our contracts and in our staffing that has not been filled up to this point. So we were able to make some adjustments, pull some expenditures out that we don't think are going to happen between now and the end of the year to get to a little bit lower contribution for our special ed, but still doing all the great things that we need to do. Universal pre-K, we received one-time funding, and once we received that funding, that's it. We anticipated not knowing for sure how much we needed to spend to implement TK this year. And Michelle Harridge has been amazing at trying to plan out and organize and spend that money exactly when we need it for exactly what we need it for. And so we've made the adjustment to move some of that revenue to next year and some of those expenditures to next year to make sure that we're fully implementing TK and getting everything at the proper times. So keep in mind, TK is not fully implemented yet. So we want to make sure we're setting aside that money to make sure that we fully implement. There were some various other categorical program adjustments that we made. As I mentioned at first interim, local donations still continue to be up. So those increased a little bit. And then local interest would be like our school funded positions. So these are positions that school parent organizations help pay for. And the funding for these had to go up because all of our salaries and our benefits went up this year. So those PTOs that were helping to pay for those positions, those costs increased so that they needed to generate more revenue to help cover those costs. And so that's why the local interest revenue is up. I know also in the past, the question has come up about CEF and getting updates on what CEF has been contributing. So on page 20 in your budget book, you'll be able to see an update on the CEF donations that have been made through second interim in case that interests you. So now we're going to move to expenditures. So many of you already know, I'll just say it one more time because it's come up just a little bit. Certificated classified salaries as well as benefits are over 81% of our school district budget now. And so obviously with the adjustments that we've made in salaries and with benefits, 81% overall of our budget is now on personnel. So that's obviously going to be the biggest thing that we're going to focus on. You'll see that in the expenditures, decreases in certificated salaries. That was savings from vacant positions that we currently have. We do leave money in the budget in case we are able to fill vacant positions between now and the end of the year. So there is money reserved for those positions in the event that we are able to fill them. Classified salaries actually went up a little bit. So if you would like to take a look at page 21 in your budget book, that's our full-time enrollment chart. That's in every budget book. And it gives you a breakdown of the FTEs or full-time equivalents and how they've changed between first interim and second interim. So have we added positions? Have we taken away positions? And so what I'll draw your attention to is our instructional assistants in SPED and in our special programs. We've increased those instructional assistants, about 11 FTE overall. So that's why you see an increase in classified salaries. We do have some savings here from vacant positions as well. Benefits. So as you know, we've made the health benefit adjustments starting in January to start covering 100% of employees' benefits. So since adopted budget, benefits have gone up over 12%. That's a really big increase within 1 year. So you'll see it's valued at about $2.5 million alone in health and welfare benefit increases. So that's a big one. Then we get into supplies and materials, services and operating, and capital outlay. So I'm going to set aside supplies and materials and services for one moment because we're going to go into a little bit more detail for those two and just talk about capital outlay. So capital outlay, we had Student Nutrition Services has a kitchen infrastructure and training fund. We weren't sure exactly the timing of the projects that they wanted to implement. So originally we put them in at first interim and then they came back and said, you know what, it's probably going to be more like next year. So we have now moved that to next year. So that's part of the adjustment you see in the decrease in expenditures, and that revenue now has moved to next year. So let's talk about supplies and materials and services and operating. So what happens when we go from first interim to second interim and we make an adjustment and we say, okay, this particular funding source, we're going to set aside this revenue, and instead of using it this year, we're going to use it next year. All those related expenditures for both supplies and services also move to next year. So what you're going to see is decreases in supplies and materials and in services and operating. And we've done a quick little chart for you just so you can get a feel. So supplies went down about 2.3 million. It's important to recognize that this isn't just extra money floating around. This is restricted money for specific resources that has to be set aside for those resources. It's just being moved to a different fiscal year. So we have an increase in our LCAP supplies and materials. That's because, as I mentioned earlier, our unduplicated pupil count increased. So therefore, we need to spend more money to support those students who need us the most. You'll see also ELOP. Derek Jackson has done an amazing job trying to spend down some of the ELOP money. When we first started ELOP, we got a lot of money up front and we were trying to get it going and we were coming out of the pandemic. And so we had a lot of money that we were trying to get going. And so now he's got boots running on the ground and spending that money. So that's why you see increases in ELOP. We also found out this year that all funding that we received through 22-23 had to be spent by June 30th of this year. So it kind of got him going even faster because we had to make sure we're spending all of the 22-23 money by June and then continuing to run our ELOP programs into future years. Our ESSER 3 funding is also up, and the reason for that is that's an expiring resource, so we need to spend that out. So we need to continue to get that money out and make sure we spend it. That has a September 30 expiration date. All the rest of these are down because we have moved the revenue and the relevant expenses over to the next fiscal year. In services, it's actually very, very similar. Things like the LCAP is up because our UPP went up, so spending and services goes up. The only other ones I want to highlight, mental health and the art, music, and instructional materials block grant. Those are new resources with new expenditures. So that's why those are up, because those are newer resources and we're starting to spend that money. And so those are up. Now we get into what we call the MYP or multi-year projection. So in your budget book, this is on page 18 and page 19 has the assumptions.
Tina,
Tina,
can I
do we want to
stop?
pause for questions?
Questions
Of course.
before you get into this?
Okay, you got it.
So do we have any questions about what we've heard so far? Sylvia?
Real quick, the ELOP money, you're saying how like it has different rules in terms of when it needs to be spent.
Yeah.
So does it also come to us at different times than the rest of the
We do
statement?
receive the revenue separate. Yeah, it's a separate resource. We do receive it separate from like our LCFF
Yeah.
funding or our state
A
funding.
different calendar?
Yeah.
For receiving and for spending.
Exactly.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Any other questions?
So I think in continuation to the same thing, I don't know how Derek is spending more money. So I just, so how do you make it faster? Like, is the program expanding in a bigger way or what additional resources you are bringing in?
That's a great question. So some of the things that Derek was doing is as we were starting, we were not at all schools. So now we are at all schools. So that's the first thing. Services have been expanding on an ongoing basis. So now we're at all schools, and correct me if I'm wrong about any of this. I'm going to do the best that I can. But what is also happening is to provide those services, we also provide third-party providers. We hire third-party providers to help provide those services. And so as we've been going, we've been expanding those services and hiring those groups to also help us expand that reach to provide some of these services. So that's how the expenses continue to grow and expand. Now we're at all schools. So now it'll just be as we add additional enrichment. So let's say, for example, one of our schools, the community really sees a need for yoga in the kids and we have a yoga provider. He might go along and we could do a contract to provide yoga to that community. So it's really about learning the community needs and listening to the community and seeing what they need, and then trying to find the resources and the support and the services to then meet that community. So that's how it grows.
Okay, that's great. And this is a restricted fund, right?
It is.
So it has to be used by another year and you cannot carry forward to the future.
So the first 2 years of funding, 21-22 and 22-23, had to be spent by June 30 of 24. Moving forward, they are going to allow us to carry. So what they're trying to do is make sure programs are getting started and getting up and getting at 100% capacity and not lollygagging along the way, right? And so that's why they're kind of pushing the envelope on that. And then once it's implemented, then if you need to carry, you can, because things do happen.
Excellent. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anybody else? I just have one sort of multiple single question. You mentioned 81% on personnel costs. Is that total compensation? And does it include the 12% additional premiums for health insurance?
Yes, so the 81% includes all salaries, all salaries for the entire district, as well as all benefits, health and welfare, and all benefits, everything. That's 81%.
That's pretty amazing. That's gone down significantly in the last 10 years.
I mean,
So this is out of our total budget.
81% of the total budget. So
So you're not talking general, okay.
The
I'm on
unrestricted
board.
general fund, it's closer to like 85,
Yeah.
87%.
Yeah, I was thinking general fund, not total budget. Okay, thank you. Anything else? All right, moving right along. Thank you, Tina.
Of course, you bet. Absolutely. Okay, so now we'll dive into the MYP. So as I mentioned, this is in your budget book, pages 18 and 19. Page 19 directly addresses some of the assumptions that we use to build the MYP. So that's a good reference tool. So the important part we want to point out on the MYP. So if you look at 23-24, you'll see we started off the beginning of the year with about $71.4 million. That was our beginning fund balance. You'll see our total revenue projected, our total expenditures projected, and you'll see the revenue less expenditures is about negative 30 million. So that means we're spending down on that beginning fund balance. So that would leave us with an ending fund balance, if everything ended the way we projected, with an ending fund balance for this year of about $41.2 million. So then the question is, out of that $41.2 million, what are the components of that ending fund balance? So we have a couple of things that are non-spendable. It's our working capital. We have to set aside a little bit of cash and some requirements. The big number here, almost about $22 million is that restricted program carryover. So that's all that money that I was talking about, of those resources that if they decided they weren't going to spend it this year and we moved it to a future year, that's where you see that restricted categorical program carryover. So we can't use that money for any other purpose other than those restricted purposes. And then below that, you'll see the 3.8 million. That's the unrestricted program carryover. So that's what is remaining in our unrestricted program carryover. Those are things like instructional materials, which is technically unrestricted, but Allison has an amazing plan, and we need to set that money aside to make sure that we have the proper money set aside for any textbooks adoptions or curriculum that we need to do. So even though it's technically unrestricted, it has a plan and a purpose. Those fall into the other various program carryovers. And then you'll see the economic uncertainty 3% reserve. This is a requirement of the state. All schools must set aside a minimum of 3% of their overall budget for a reserve. And then you'll see the additional board reserve. So you'll remember the board has made a commitment. They prefer to try and generate an additional 7% in reserve for economic uncertainties for a total of 10%. Based on what you're seeing here, the 7.5 million in 3%, there's another 7.5 million, which would be another 3%. That's about 15 million in reserve, which puts our reserve at 6%. That's obviously below the 10% that we want to try and hit. And so that's where our target is. And that's what we continue to work really, really hard to try and get to. That additional board reserve is becoming more and more critical due to our transition into basic aid funding, which Chris is going to talk about next in the next part of the presentation. But that board reserve is going to become more and more critical as we transition into basic aid. Then as you look at future years, you can see 24-25, we're at a combined reserve of about 7.44. In 25-26, we're at a combined reserve of about 6.14. In 26-27, you'll notice that's the first year that our revenue less our expenditures is actually positive and not negative. So that's when our deficit spending is stopping officially. And our board reserve for 26-27 is at about 6.22%. And then you get into 27-28 and we're almost to that 10% reserve that we want to be at. So it's really important to understand and know that that estimated fund balance, you might see that, you know, at the bottom line, there's that estimated fund balance, but that's not really a true picture of what available money there is those monies are truly tied up in specific purposes. And there's really not a lot of other money to work with, especially as we try to get to that 10% board reserve.
Actually, before we go on, can I add a few things to what Tina was sharing? That line item that she pointed out, the $21.9 million, that category number. When you go back and compare that to first interim, that number at that time was about $12 million. So that line item has grown from 12 million to 21 million. And that's pretty much what Tina described as as we pulled back some of those monies that were in the budget as the first interim and are being repurposed or reallocated toward next year. That money literally just moved from the top in the current year down to the bottom to be reserved so that it then becomes part of next year's budget. So I just want to make sure that we point that out. And then also too, as a first interim, as you may recall, we were projecting at that time that we were going to have a 10% reserve at the end of 23-24. And the reasons why we can't show that right now, because we have added some expenditures to the budget. And I think the largest portion is that increase in the health and benefit costs. So just with the cost of the increase in the premiums and then the increased contribution to cover 100% of all of our employees, that added about $2.4 million that we did not have line itemed as a first interim. As you recall, we were at that time of the year where we were waiting to see what the results of open enrollment. We knew the premiums were going up, but we didn't know yet how many people were going to switch plans, come back into the district's health benefit plans. And so this is really kind of indicative of that. So that's one of the main reasons why the reserve is not as high as we showed to you back in first interim.
And I just want to clarify that the reserve wasn't shown as 10% in 23-24. It was at 6.9%.
Oh, was it? I'm sorry.
First interim, it was the 25-26 when it was a 10% on the multi-year, and now that's been reduced.
Okay, I apologize. All right.
The last slide, and then I'll turn it over to Chris. Was there a question?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so one is like we are keeping the reserve here this way, but this is I don't think we have made any assumption of any salary increase or anything, right?
Correct.
In this case. So in case of course that will happen, but so what's going to happen for them? Because we are trying to keep it the 6 or around 6% across. So how is it going to impact overall?
That would have to be the discussion we have as to where do we reduce money out to free up some of the money in the general fund? Are there some items that we could move from general fund into the restricted that we haven't done so yet? Are we open to entertaining reducing the reserve down below to what it's estimated and that 9%? So that will be all those conversations we're going to have as we move forward into salary negotiations, because this represents no salary negotiations for the 24-25 or beyond.
And this additional board reserve it's keep varying, right? Quite a lot actually, like 7.5, 10. So what is that a specific percentage you are putting it, or a random number there? How is that? Like for example, this year the current one 7.5, then it went to 10.8, then it came down to 7.6. It's not a specific percentage, right?
So what's happening is at the end of the year, whatever remaining money is in the general fund that is unrestricted gets moved into that. So that's why that percentage is fluctuating. I'm basically plugging it in based on what we have available, and that's all that's left.
Okay.
And the 1% is contingent on what our funds, our revenue, or excuse me, our budget is.
Expenditures, total expenditures.
Anybody else? Okay, thank you. Moving right along.
Yeah, for the very last page, and then I'm going to turn it over to Chris. You've seen this chart before. This is a summary of how we plan to spend our resources in 23-24. Just want to highlight the main sections. Bottom right-hand corner, functions 1,000 to 1,190. That's 63% of our budget. So that's our general instruction and our special ed budgets. That's 63% of our overall budget. So that makes up the function 1,000 instruction and the function 1,000. So those two add up to that one. In function 2,000, the instruction related is about 12%. Function 3,000, which is our pupil services, is about 7%. Function 7,000 is our general admin, that's about 7%. And then function 8,000 is our maintenance and operations at about 9%. So overall, what's important to note is that the majority of the budget is set aside and is geared towards and connected directly to the support of our students in instruction. And so we just wanted to point that out. And I'll turn it over to Chris.
Great, thank you, Tina. So this ends the first part of the presentation on terms of what second interim is. And as Stacy mentioned, we will be bringing back the second interim report to the board for consideration at our meeting on March 14th. But I felt that I want to take some time now, and this will be kind of an ongoing conversation as we move into basic aid, just to understand some of the nuances about that. So let me dive into this part. And so first I want to start off by saying that when we start talking about the budget, again, nothing's changed as far as the factors that go into planning the budget. We still have an environment where we're still relying on some things that are driven by COLA, but the majority of our funding is going to be based off of property taxes. And then there's other planning assumptions that we have to build into the budget. But overall, as Tina mentioned, we're looking at our budget over a period of multiple years. So imagine 5 years of different assumptions, whether they're revenue assumption or expenditure assumptions over time, and that throughout the year, those assumptions change. And so we'll talk a little bit about when those assumptions change in a few minutes, but I just want to start off with that. But I think it's good to get a little bit more of a historical perspective in terms of how we've moved into basic aid. And so when you go back and look at over time, our school district, like other public education districts, their funding is based upon whatever that state statutory COLA is. So everything, the graph on the far left-hand side represents what the state approved COLA has been over time, going back to 83, 84. So you get a sense in terms of very good years and bad years. There was actually 1 year that the COLA was a negative 0.39%. So that was the un-COLA year, as we used to joke about that. But you can see there on the bubble, that year, 12-13 is when we transitioned into LCFF funding. But then during that period of time before LCFF, even though the state COLA was, as mentioned on the graph here, we weren't actually getting the full amount of our funding. During that period of time, we were feeling the effects of the economy, and our funding was deficited for several years in a row. At one point in time, the state deficit for our funding was over 20%. And so we were operating literally with 80% of our funding to get through those very lean years. And then it took several years to fully restore that deficit. And we talk a little bit more about that, because it actually, even going into LCFF, we were still operating with this state revenue deficit. And it wasn't until a couple of years ago that we were finally made whole. And the next couple of graphs kind of show you really that trajectory. But anyway, this is just want to give you some history as far as COLA and the deficits. But before I get into that new chart I want to share with you, I just want to kind of point out a couple of things. And so this is really what I'm calling really the shift in understanding. When you look at LCFF funding, the two main components of LCFF funding is COLA, which determines the per pupil allocation that we get, and then the number of kiddos that we have. So the number of kiddos is based upon enrollment, and then we know that our funding is based off of not actual enrollment, but actual average daily attendance. So when you look at those two numbers, you put them together and you determine how much our LCFF entitlement is. But when you look at when we get information in regards to the COLA and when we get information around enrollment, that that information is generally known for the beginning of the year. So when you look at COLA, obviously the governor comes out in January, gives us his projection of the upcoming year's COLA, but the actual COLA does not get set until the state enacts its budget in July. And as I mentioned, the governor then throughout the year, January and May, will come back and update his COLA projections for the out years. And then for enrollment purposes, we take our October CBED numbers and we do a projection at that point in time, but then we actually have to wait until April to actually get confirmation as far as what our P2 numbers are for the year. And so once we have those two numbers, then we can confirm how much total revenue that we're getting in the current year. But then for purposes of property taxes, it's a little bit different animal because really property taxes at the beginning of the year is an estimate, it's a projection. The state, the county assessor's office actually provides a preliminary estimate for the coming year's property taxes, and that information is shared with us in August. So imagine at the beginning of the year, we're given a projection to plan out for the rest of the year. But the reality is that we won't know what the final total amount of property taxes that we get to spend for the year. We won't know that until the end of the year. So really, I just want to kind of point out here, this is a big shift for us because as we plan as we plan for the current year, we've been having the majority of the knowledge of how much money we're supposed to get earlier on the year. But now as we shift to basic aid, more of the dependence on getting that final number, we're not going to really know until the end of the year. And I think this is the one other reasons why we've talked about why basic aid districts have to carry a little bit higher reserve than the normal 3%. One, to mainly deal with the volatility of property taxes, because some years it could be a little more, some could be a little less. But I mean, for the main part, property taxes are growing at a certain rate. But if you overproject or underproject, you can imagine how much of trouble a district can get into if they don't have the reserves to deal with it. And then just the cash flow perspective. With property taxes, homeowners are paying their property taxes in December and April. And once people pay their property taxes, then the county transfers that money to us. So we are getting our money twice a year, whereas before with the LCFF entitlement model, we were getting a monthly apportionment. So that, again, further compounds the situation. But those are just some of the things that we just need to understand as we move into this basic aid model, because it's going to change how we plan for some things, but doesn't change how we build the budget, but just changes the timing of when we know information.
I'm going to pause for any questions.
Sylvia.
You said for the basic aid, the property taxes we won't know until the end of the year what our revenue is. What's the end of the year?
June.
Okay.
End of the fiscal year.
End of the
right?
fiscal year.
End of the fiscal year. Okay. But so that's in the slide in slide 12. So the June confirmation, that's the end of the year.
End of the fiscal year.
End of the fiscal year versus in LCFF, we would know in May because of the state.
Well, again, keep in mind, let's look at it just 1 year. So for this budget year here, July 23 was the beginning of our fiscal year. We knew what the COLA was. We know how many kiddos that we had at the beginning of the year. Regardless, because we're not basic aid, the property tax, knowing that what that property tax number isn't as important in that scenario, because we'll get the final confirmation with the property taxes as of June, this coming June. But now going forward, the property tax information, we won't get the confirmation until the back end of the fiscal year.
And then you said we only get it twice a year versus monthly. So what are those two what are the dates for the twice a year?
December and April-ish.
Same as what we pay in our property tax.
Okay,
So the LCFF, if you think of it, is, if you use our current year, by July of 2023, we knew what our COLA was gonna be, we could embed it, plus our CBEDS numbers were used from the year prior, so we had all that information. With the basic aid community funded, we really don't know that until the following year, we're truly basing it off projections, that's kind of the mind shift we're shifting around a year and a half difference.
Satish?
So I think I have a different perspective here. Property tax, why it is not predictable? I thought that property tax is it doesn't vary much, actually. It's been only going steadily up. So at least we can take the last year reference as the thing. It not you know, either
know what you mean.
own the house, and we all know that it never goes down what we are paying at least, right?
And we'll talk about that, but that's a great segue.
Yeah, so and another thing, okay, so that's so I think going to basic aid should not be highly uncertain from that point. And next thing is there is no other cost of adjustment coming once we get into basic aid. You don't get anything equivalent to COLA, something of that kind, or we purely depending only on property tax.
Well, as I mentioned, as we move into basic aid, the majority of our funding is becoming less and less dependent upon COLA, but we do have some state programs that we still get a COLA on. So there are some programs like Nicole's Student Nutrition Services funding from the state. That's all subject to COLA. SPED, special education funding is subject to COLA. And then on top of that, our federal funding, our title programs get whatever the federal entitlement increases are from year to year. So there are some things that are still subject to COLA, but the majority of, or at least the bulk of our main funding shifts mainly the property tax.
Is it like about a 1/3 of our total programs will get COLA, or is it even lower than that?
Probably less than
that.
less than
Less
that.
than that, okay.
Yeah.
And actually, I think I provided some information, and I can resubmit it to the board, a list of all those programs that we participate in that are subject to COLA. And then you mentioned about ELOP. So here's one of those other examples. ELOP is one of those state programs. Even though it's a state program, they haven't been giving it COLA.
In fact, they cut it this year a little bit.
Yeah. So there are things like transportation also over all these years since LCFF. We've gotten the same amount of funding for transportation, but yet the state did not provide any extra funding in the form of a COLA. So there are some things that you would think are subject to COLA that aren't getting a COLA.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else? Jerry?
Yes, I have a question on the previous slide. If we go back one on slide 11, I understand that the graph on the right's about, the deficit, the shortfalls and the state funding. I'm not sure why it's there. Could you explain sort of the relevance to the discussion we're having here? Since we're based the graph, the histogram on the right.
Okay, I think I might be able to address that question when I talk about that one slide in a few minutes.
Sure, that's fine. I'll hold it for then.
But yeah, this is really kind of a little bit more perspective of where we came from. But I'll talk a little bit more in depth why.
Okay, great, thanks.
Ava?
Yeah, thank you for clarifying what you meant by year as in the fiscal year. I had a question about I know that we're moving into basic aid. Maybe later on, or maybe you can provide it the list of the districts in which surround us, if they're in basic aid or LCFF.
The list also was in the last budget book because it was in that presentation of the basic aid districts.
Okay.
Yeah, we can provide it. We can resubmit it.
Okay, thank you.
I don't have a question, but I am going to use this as a bully pulpit. Because I think for all the reasons Chris just said, we have to be very careful about that reserve. And I think going out another 5 years before we get to 10% is irresponsible of us, to be honest. I think we need to look at getting to that 10% much faster than that. So that's my soapbox. Thank you.
We'll have opportunities later for other soapboxes, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, all right.
What we're gonna talk about today. Okay.
All right.
All right. kind of going back to one of the questions that Jerry brought up, I created this chart to kind of, again, give us a little bit more historical knowledge of our district. I'm going to stand up and kind of, it's easier for me to point to things if you don't mind.
You want to take the handheld microphone with you? Up the podium? Or maybe set it.
Oh, thank you. Just to kind of orient everyone to this graph. This graph kind of shows several different things. This top blue line with the dots represents our enrollment over time. So this goes back to 2009-10. This is where we were enrollment wise, little over 18,000 kiddos. And then obviously you can see the trajectory. We grew closer to 19.1, and then we started to trend downward. And so that represents just where we are, where we have been actually with enrollment. This green line here represents what our funding entitlement was based off of the number of students that we have, based off of how much money we were entitled to receive per student. So this is how much we were entitled to receive. However, as I mentioned a little earlier, we weren't getting full funding. We were deficited. So this yellow line here actually represents how much we actually received. So the gap between the green and the yellow line represents those years that we are operating with those deficits. We eventually made up that deficit. We didn't make up the deficit until 2018-19 when the yellow line equaled the green line. This, I guess, orangish line below this represents property taxes. And as Satish was mentioning, property taxes, do they grow? And they do. So when you look at the historical information with property taxes, our property taxes have been kind of growing at a historical rate on an average basis, about 5%, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less. Because that number becomes more important later when we start projecting out the future years. I'll save that for just a moment. So this line here represents property taxes. It grows, and I'll talk a little bit about this little dip here, this ERAF dip. This gray line here represents how much money we are getting from the state. There's a minimum state amount of funding that we get. And then in addition to that, there were years where additional funding came from the state. And that additional funding from the state really was intended to make up for the difference in what you didn't get as far as property taxes. So really this state line here kind of represents what your entitlement is, taking into account how much you got for property taxes, then the state makes up the difference. And then this last blue line here just kind of illustrates those deficits. So when you go back in 2009-10, we were operating with a funding deficit. It dropped again a little bit in 2013-14, but then the state was making up that deficit, and we've eventually were made whole, as I said, around 1920, it looks like. So now this blue line here, we've been at zero for the last couple of years, but now, as you can see here in 23-24, that blue line starts to rise above zero. And that really is also describing that us moving into basic aid, we're actually operating with now excess taxes. So then kind of going back in time, prior to 1213, we were what was called a revenue limit district. 1213 was the inception of LCFF. So between 1213 and 2021, what's the significance of 2021? That was the 1 year we fell into basic aid. And we didn't know that we fell into basic aid until the end of the year, because when we got the final tax collections, we were over into the basic aid status by about $5 to $6 million that year. So that's why 2021, you can see where the yellow line was higher than the green line. The green line represents the entitlement amount that we were supposed to get based off of the number of kids. But the actual funding, which is now this yellow line here, was a little bit higher. That's about $5 to $6 million increase. But you can see here where we dropped back down to the green line in 21, 22 and stayed at that same level in 22, 23. And so what technically happened was we fell back out of basic aid. And I think you've heard us talk about why we fell out of basic aid. One of the reasons why we fell out of basic aid was we were the benefactor of that ADA hold harmless. So we had the first ADA hold harmless where we were funded at a higher ADA level back to 2019-20. And the following year, the state came back based that year's funding based off then a 3-year average. So we literally had 2 years of a hold harmless. And the last thing that kept us from going into basic aid this last year was the new TK grade expansion. So with that, I think it's kind of straightforward to understand that we just now incorporated more students that was not into the formula by adding a whole bunch of new TK kids. And it just pushed us back or kept us in LCF funding for one more year. So I keep joking with Stacy that we're going to make it to basic aid one of these days. And I think this is what's going to happen. We are going to move into basic aid going into 24, 25 for several reasons. One, based off of the projected COLA right now at 0.76, based off of what we're projecting our ADA for 24, 25, and now based off of where we project our property taxes to be for next year, we're projecting that our property taxes are going to exceed how much money we're entitled to receive if we were funded based off of a per pupil formula. And then going back to what Satish was asking about property taxes. So yes, property taxes, as you can see here, are growing constantly year over year over year. Now, as I said, historically, our property tax has been growing somewhere between 5 and 6, sometimes more, sometimes less. But we don't know yet what the projections are for the out years. So for purposes of our planning, we're projecting that the assessed value, the AV growth for those that own homes in our community are going to be growing at a rate of 6%. And then we also heard of Proposition 13. Proposition 13 places a limit on how much one's property can grow in any one year, and it's 1%. And so we're projecting a 6% growth. 1% of that is the amount based off of Proposition 13. The other 5% is based off of properties being reassessed, and also any new properties or any properties that have home improvements. So when the county reassesses property values, that's what goes into the rest of that number. But I just want to point out that 1% of that 6% projection is really limited to what Proposition 13 limits the growth. And then I mentioned something about that ERAF bubble here. So we've talked about what ERAF is. ERAF is the Educational Revenue Augmentation Fund. That's where the county manages to shift tax monies between other local agencies. And so I guess the story at the end of the day is that even with this kind of an adjustment to our property taxes, school districts like us are still made whole at the end of the day. So imagine the county shifting some of our property taxes outside of our district. But what it means is that we are made whole, and that responsibility then falls back to the state. So the state comes back and backfills this adjustment for ERAF. And so you can see here that gray line we got an infusion of additional state funding to help offset that. So at the end of the day, we got exactly, but we didn't get, I mean, we got exactly what we were entitled to. We didn't get anything more or anything less. But that's just kind of one of the things that with all these tax laws of the state that they do. And those are some things that kind of help factor into our moving into basic aid. Anyway, I'll stop and ask for any questions.
Any questions, comments? Satish?
Okay, I can go first. So one is like, I think this basic aid is mainly based on the enrollment, like mainly, okay? So the projection, at least, the demographers projection, it has been stable at least this year, the current year. I thought it's more than what it was projected, the number wise. Okay, and my question is, now we are showing a steady declining after that.
For the enrollment? Okay.
Enrollment. So what is the threshold here for us to maintain this basic aid? What it means is, let's say it does not go next year to 1,000 something. Still, let's say we stay steady. Okay, what we have now will continue to stay next to 4 years. So will it have an impact on falling into basic aid, or it will come back?
Well, I'll attempt, and Chris, please chime in. I think as we look, because our enrollment continues to slightly decline and then stabilize, but our property taxes are going up. For us to shift out of basic aid back to LCFF, we would have to see an influx in our enrollment, a fairly significant enrollment influx. You know, we're probably talking 2,000 students to come in a year. That in conjunction with, if we had one of those large COLAs, maybe the governor comes back and gives a 8-9% COLA. So it would take those two factors, I think, for us to shift out of basic aid.
Okay, so I think we are fairly confident on that. We will stay in basic aid for some, like, yeah. Okay, thanks.
Anything else? Jared?
First of all, I really like this graph. I thank you for putting this together. There's so much information here. I know over the years, we've tried different metaphors to try to explain basic aid and LCFF, right? And then we've had buckets of sand and water and little mountains. And I think what I realized after seeing what you have here is those are really snapshots in time. And what you show here is basically lines converging. I just think there might be a tool for us to explain that transition, and then the magnitude of when you're first into basic aid, there isn't that much difference. This really shows that well. So just one comment. I just wanted to clarify, because before we were using 5% for property growth, and you're saying 6 now because you really haven't changed your model. You're just accounting for this 1% from Prop 13. I'm just wondering if there's a shift in changing, a change in sort of our thinking. Is there a change in guidance? Because 5-6%, I mean, that's like 16%, right?
It's a big difference. Yeah,
Right.
1%.
Yeah.
Well, I think we moved from 5% when we initially started talking about going to basic aid. We moved it to 6 because it was really more reflective of what the actual numbers were. So like last year, it was 6%.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's the reasons why we changed our assumption to build everything based off of a 6% growth.
Okay, so that's all right. Okay, thanks, Phyllis.
Anybody else? Okay,
I forgot my question. I should write it down.
we're ready to move on.
Okay, and this kind of, I think this is the last slide, but kind of going back to, again, just those sequence of events that I think people need to understand is that we are going into a situation where we're building a budget in June and enacting our budget in July. The state enacts its budget in July. And then we deal with this whole thing about when we find out that property tax number. So kind of these little bubbles here kind of tells you what's going on. So we know what the current year's COLA is by July of each fiscal year. The county gives us a preliminary number for that year's property taxes. We know that in August. By December, we know what that year's funding is, because we know how many kids, and we're going to estimate what our ADA is for that year. So pretty much, I think we've nailed down the current year's funding by December. But then we start planning the following year's budget. So we start getting new COLA projections in January get an update in May. And then when we come back to you in June, we'll know what the year's property taxes are. But yet, to build out the 24, 25, I'm sorry, this is 24, 25, but to build out the 25, 26 fiscal year budget, we're going to go into building a budget not knowing what that property tax, the actual property tax. We're going to project based off of that growth, but we won't have the actual number until we get to the end of the year. All right, I think that's all that I had. Oh, no, I did have a few more slides. Kind of a little bit more of the nuts and bolts on the property taxes. So not quite $51.9 billion of assessed value that we have in our community, growing at a rate of 6%. And I found this number here too. Of all the property owners, corporations, everything in our community, there's about $14.4 billion of assessed value that's being disputed. I think we've gotten the money from that standpoint, but that's the appeal process, because if the county then goes back and affirms that they were overestimating, then they'll go back and adjust those property taxes. But that's just something that it has always intrigued me by how many of our property owners over here don't agree with what the tax collector says that the tax bill is every year. So those are the homeowners, the secured property taxes, $52 billion. All the unsecured properties, about $1.2 billion. But when you translate assessed value to dollars, how much money we get. So for secured property taxes, roughly speaking, we get 1/4% of the assessed value. So when you take $52 billion, we generate about not quite $130 million of secured property revenue. So it's about 1/4%. And then for the unsecured property taxes, that number, there isn't an easy way to project that number. So what we are now doing is basically kind of taking a 4-year average. So the 4-year average of the assessed property values is $6.9 million, and it's roughly about 1/2%. So obviously the majority of the property taxes are generated from homes, not necessarily these business and their related business tax items. But that kind of gives you a sense in terms of the funding. And then we talked about other things, ERAF. We get some additional supplemental property tax revenue, and then homeowners exemption. So this is the breakdown of all the different pockets of taxes. And then Stacy wanted me to kind of share this information. I apologize, I cut off part of it here, but this is the single family homes assessed value. So this is something that Dale Scott brought to our attention as we started talking about our community, the amount of parcels. So there's roughly about 29,000 parcels in our community as of 2021. The average assessed value of all these parcels is only $1,028,000. The median assessed value is only $910,000. But you can see over here, obviously, there's roughly not quite 5,000 homeowners whose a property for a single family home is assessed of under $200,000. And maybe ask the group here, I mean, what probably resonates as to why the assessed value is so low for as many as 5,000 homes, and the assessed value is under $200,000.
Prop 13.
Prop 13, yeah.
Yeah, if you look at the total numbers, and again, this was from 2021, about 30% are assessed at under 600,000. And so, I think when we talk about property taxes, there's been that belief that we generate the unsecured from Apple, or we generate these high property taxes. But in reality, until homeowners change or make those improvements, their property isn't assessed at that higher value. So, I don't know that we could go anywhere in our community and purchase a home for 200,000 right now. That would be lovely, but not happening.
I believe that's it. I'll entertain any questions.
Again, one more slide.
Is one
Oh.
more.
Let's get out of here. Just I was kind of end on where we're gonna go next. And so obviously right now it's right now just monitoring, seeing what happens. So we'll know a little bit more. I mean, we do know that the state budget and what we heard just 3 or 4 weeks ago has changed considerably. I mean, back in January is when the governor and the legislative analyst office was projecting a state deficit of around $68 billion at that time. I've heard it's grown up to $72 billion. So things change, and things can change pretty quickly here. But really, we're kind of wait and see what the governor comes out with as may revise. We're going to plan accordingly. But I think I've told Stacy this. I think the good thing about all of this as we talk about moving into basic aid, I think from a timing standpoint, I think we picked a very good time to move into basic aid because we are now not relying as much on COLA, but now relying on property taxes. So I guess there's a little bit of a silver lining here a little bit as we move forward from that standpoint. We're not nearly in the same boat as I think a lot of other districts right now that we're building a budget on a 3.93% COLA and now have to build a budget off of a 0.76% COLA. Anyway, so we'll bring back this on March 14th and we can have more discussion at that point in time.
Okay, does he have any more slides, Stacy?
There is one more slide.
Okay, so questions, comments, anybody want to get on their soapbox? Start with Ava.
I have a question on your slide on secured and unsecured, basically the difference of taxes coming from residential versus the businesses. Are the percentages that we're getting in terms of the taxes the same for secured and unsecured?
Percentage of the
Of the taxes, like how much money that we're getting from secured
yeah.
and unsecured?
Let me go back.
It was 4 slides back, I think. That one, yeah.
So remember, everything's driven off of the assessed value. So
Right.
the actual home properties, 52 billion, and then all those business properties, their assets and all that represents $1.2 billion of assessed value. And then how much that translates to dollars for the unsecured property taxes based off of $1.2 million of assessed value. It's about $7 million or about 0.5%.
Okay.
And then apply the same methodology for the secured property taxes.
It's 1.2 trillion, right?
Okay, Ava, anything more?
Yeah, the following slide, the one that we got from Del Scott, that was from the numbers from 2020 to 2021. Are we going to get an updated on that in terms of how the housing has shifted to more recent?
We could ask for one, and he
Yeah.
had just recently shared this, so I don't know how much they update it, but we can certainly ask for one.
Because I wonder how that would affect us in terms of looking into, and of course, depending on how the report comes out for the bond questionnaire that we have.
We can certainly ask.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, Satish.
Yeah, so I think in this unsecured and secured, why it is okay and unsecured means is it not guaranteed or why it is called unsecured?
I'm gonna have to come back with
They're
that. please.
businesses, we don't, that they are.
So we don't, it can vary or that's what the uncertainty is high or?
Well, I think because it's they say it's secured, that you actually have a physical asset
Okay.
that you're basically levying against. Unsecured is that you have, say properties, vehicles, boats, all those things.
Oh,
It's not like a piece of real estate.
I see. Okay. Okay, thank you.
Sylvia?
So I'm not sure I understand the 1/4% revenue that we received. Like, where does that formula come from? That of that amount that we get
Okay.
0.25 of 1%.
So I don't have enough of how the county calculates how much we get, other than we have a value, assessed value, we have an amount that we actually receive, and so this was our way of doing the math to project how much property tax revenue we're going to generate just based off of the assessed value. It just happens to be roughly about 1/4 of what 1% of the assessed value.
I see. Okay, so it's not like we get a quarter and the,
Oh, no, but there are tax
school
rates. There's
gets
a
like-
tax rate
uh-huh,
that applies. I just don't know how much
sure.
goes to, us per se. But I can pull that up.
And just so I have an understanding, like we're receiving that property tax revenue, the other school districts in the county receive it, the cities receive it, who else is
All local
receiving?
governments receive some form of property taxes,
Okay, so
school
just
districts included.
school districts and, okay. All right. Okay, thank
Jerry,
you.
do you have anything?
I have just soapbox comments. No.
There you go.
All right, okay. So two main things. The first one is I really want to thank both of you, Chris and Tina, for, I've noticed over the last couple of these presentations, the information density in the presentation has really gotten better. So I just calling out a couple of things. I like the fact that the background material, the agenda, there's actually a lot of good information there. I think for residents that just flip through, looking at our agenda, there's information. Thanks for doing that. I think I know this was in the first interim, but the fact you included now the assumptions of your the multi-year projection models, I didn't think we had that before. So that helps me to look at what some of the drivers. So appreciate that. Even like I was reading this, right? And like I used to have to turn my head like 90 degrees. Even a lot of that's gone. It's not all gone, but it's like mostly gone now. So thank you for that. And so just so I can see just the care that's gone into this. Thank you very much for this. My soapbox comment is really about, I think, dovetailing on what Phyllis talked about, is just the concern about the future. And what caught my attention when I was going through the material is that the part that caught my attention is really, you look at 2 years, our in-year balance, so our first interim, 30 million, now it's 15 million. That's a huge swing, right? And then Chris, in your presentation, you talked about, wow, that's really just the 6% reserve plus some working capital, and that's pretty much it, which pretty much means, and this is before Satish had brought up, we're not even talking about any sort of increases. So I know the sort of, and then I just want to add a +1 to, I very much concur with what Phyllis said about just climbing, I think after what you've shared here and then the variability in the property tax, I'm very much in favor of finding our way back to 10% much sooner than, well, it's not even there right now, 5 years out. So I know the next time we're going to really look at this is probably sometime in June when we start looking at the 2024-25 budget. So I just kind of want to add my sort of +1s on, this is a $200 million enterprise, right? So it takes a while for things to turn. So I think actions we can take, I'd love to sort of understand more about actions we can take for that, not have that ending fund balance be essentially the reserve plus working capital 2-3 years out. And then coupled to that, the longer term goal that Phyllis outlined of seeing, are there, I like to see at least what the options are. These may be painful options and may require sacrifices in other areas, but I'd like to just understand what they are and have a good discussion about that when this next comes back in June, when we look at the next year's adopted budget.
And I would +1 to that. And I would love for the staff to come back with, as Jerry said, some places that we can make cuts if that's what's necessary to bring that reserve up. I just feel so strongly about that. So I would love for y'all to think about that between now and June as we look at the out years. Okay, anything else?
I also want a +1 on like how much effort both these presentations have gone and changed over the years, the last year, in terms of having more detail, not only in the agenda, but also, and really love that one with 5 or 6 different lines of seeing the history and the budget and the changes and where those are at and where it dipped down and raft. That was great. Because it's not only accessible for us, but accessible for the public. Looking at us going into basic aid, it seems like 95%, if we get 1/4 of 1%, that's by the numbers that you're doing, it's about 95% of our budget will be dependent on residential and about 5% on businesses. And that's kind of like, and if that's what we're relying on going forward, and I like that that's what we're gonna be dependent on. And so it's good to hear that the percentage of the housing prices have been going steadily. Not only that, I think Jerry even mentioned it's not 5%, it's 6%. And so that gives me sort of like a positive output and makes me think, I wonder, I'll look at the city and how our city is, since most of our school district area is that. And I think the number 2, would that be in Sunnyvale? I think in terms of like our area, in terms of Cupertino, how their city is dealing with housing and how that's affect us. And of course, now that we're going basic aid, but it also will affect the number of kids that we serve too, to kind of keep that in mind. So, thank you.
Satish or Sylvia, Satish?
Yeah, I can just go. So I think just one question and some clarification, then I can talk. 25-26 onwards, the multi-year projection, is it based on basic aid or is it still, because I don't see a significant difference for a 6% growth kind of thing in the revenue. Is it very conservative numbers what you are putting there, or you think that this could go higher?
The 6% assessed value growth, I think is pretty. I can say that's not conservative. I think it's probably right there on the border of probably ambitious.
Okay. Yeah, that's right. So the current assumption there is 25 to 20. That the second part of the multi-year, that is based on basic aid, the projection.
Yes.
However, it is a little bit of cautious. We were cautious when we are projecting, right? So that's what I don't. Big change in the revenue. Can I assume that?
So from 24, 25 on, all of our assumptions are that we are basic aid. It's built on that projected property tax. It is not taking into account. There's still a small COLA. It is projected to go back up to 2 or 3% in the outlying years. But again, that affects a small portion of our budget. So that does reflect staying in basic aid for all of our outlying years on this budget.
Yeah. So I'm wondering again, based on the, whatever fellas and Jerry, they were talking about the reserve, right? So how do we get back into this? Because this 1% of our changes, like it's about 1.7, right? We always say it's quite a lot of change. So to bring back into kind of like another 4%, maybe it's about 6, 7, whatever, 10 million, let's say. That kind of changes to make it will be very hard based on this, what I see, unless we find some other way. So we need to be very, very.
Yeah,
that optimist. I'm not able to be very optimistic on that. That's why my concern.
Well, I think it will still be that that pairing of two different things. One is we need to take a look at where we're spending our money and make decisions on where do we want to put our money. Are there some things that maybe we don't need to cover anymore? Maybe there's some new areas. The other areas always, we still have some properties that CUSD owns that I think we are looking at how do we optimize and ensure that we're getting the most money. So, trying to generate some additional revenue coming in, I think is important. The other is passing a bond so that some of our money that maybe we are spending on facilities, we could shift and have covered under the bond. So, it's almost like those 3 layers, but I do think it takes that study session where we just sit down and, it's time to take that deep dive into our budget. I think we're very fortunate as we're looking at our surrounding districts and the districts in the state of California. We're not coming forward to the board this year with any layoffs or reductions. That may be something that we have to come back and revisit because we are in declining enrollment, and should we be decreasing in some of the items that we have because our enrollment is going down? And, you know, I think all those pieces have to be part of that discussion.
Great. Well, thank you. That's it.
Sylvia, anything?
Thank you, Chris.
I just have one more question. Chris, I'm not sure I heard you correctly, but I think what you said is that over this historical graph that you have, the state has always made us whole. And is that what you said?
What I was referring to is over time, our entitlement amount was always a number out there that we were striving to receive. There were several years that we weren't made whole.
Right, okay.
But we were made whole in time. So the state paid us back for all those prior years.
But not the years we had mid-year cuts. I think we made ourselves whole.
Yeah, I mean, all I remember was they paid back the deficit, but every year the minimum funding per student was always increasing by the COLA, but they made up that gap kind of over several years. So in a way, we were made whole. They paid us back for all the prior years, and it did factor in the increase per pupil when you take into account those COLAs year over year.
Okay, but I remember those years being pretty painful.
Those years were, it was the future years that they made us the whole.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And Tina and Chris, again, +1 to what everyone said. It was an outstanding presentation. Really appreciate it. And we'll revisit this on March 14th, yes?
Yes.
Okay,
Phyllis, can I add
sure.
something else? If we're looking into saving money, and I don't know if it is something to consider as an option now or the future years, is like looking at retirement incentives, in which other people have said called like the golden handshake. And for those who aren't familiar, is that you have incentives of people who've been teaching in district, and in our district, there's a large number of people who, I mean, we're such a good district that we've retained a lot of teachers who've been teaching many years, more than 25 years, 25 years. And having a retirement incentive is that the idea is that you have a lot more people, a lot more experience, which costs a lot more money. And then that would offset and probably save money as you hire on new people that may not cost as much. So like that's an option. I know we're talking about options, so I'm not sure if that's something that's appropriate for this year or the future years, but it is an option.
I know that HR has been taking a look at that, and it's always that the challenge is always looking at when we offered it in the past, it was because we were needing to reduce staff, and so it was a benefit for us. We didn't have to lay off teachers or certificated staff because they were able to take that retirement incentive. Now there's also that consideration is if we have this incentive and we lose our veteran teachers, there isn't necessarily that new force coming in that there's a lot of available teachers. And so then we end up hiring short-term subs, long-term subs, they come and go, so there really is a cost analysis that we have to look up.
I mean, that's why I didn't say I'm
but absolutely just had a
option.
conversation earlier today at a staff meeting. So.
Yeah.
Okay, anything else before we move on? All right, thank you again, Chris and Tina.
Thank you.
So our next agenda item is public comment on closed session. Do we have anything, Erin?
No, we do not.
Okay. All right, then with that, we're going to adjourn to closed session.